Roswell has been discussed in the paranormal world for decades, which is not a surprise when you consider all the allegations of a crashed saucer, aliens, and government cover-up. Heck, we have taken a look at it here many times as well, so it's no wonder that numerous conspiracies and mysteries surrounding Roswell itself has also popped up. One of the most popular ones is about a woman known as Miriam Bush. Miriam, in various sources online, has been labeled as a nurse at a hospital field in Roswell Army Airfield, but that's actually incorrect, as she was actually an executive secretary, meaning she was an assistant to one of the higher-ranking officers on the entire base, and thus would have knew way more about the Roswell crash than you might imagine. Actually, she was the secretary for a lieutenant colonel named Harold Warren, who was said to have played a pivotal role in the autopsies of the dead people, or dead beings, found in the Roswell crash. And since Miriam was so close to the lieutenant colonel, she was in a good position to see all the mangled bodies which were snuck onto the base. And it's because of that reason that Miriam's life would take a bad turn, because according to her sister-in-law, a lady named Pat Bush, Miriam would come home from work one day extremely anxious about something that had occurred. And during dinner, she told the family that her boss took her aside to show her something. When he opened the door, she seen the bodies of what she first thought were children lying out on tables. But that's when she noticed that these were not children. They had grayish to brown skin covered with linens and had large heads with staring eyes, which of course, these later on would become known as the Roswell aliens. But she would state that they all looked deceased when all of a sudden one of them moved its hand, before she quickly left the room. But the following day it got creepier, because according to Pat, when Miriam arrived, her whole mood completely changed. She was frightened and told her family that they could never discuss what she had told them the day before. And after this, the whole Roswell affair took control of her life. She'd become increasingly paranoid. Her marriage would start to suffer, and it ended up being a toxic relationship. And before long, she began to drink. And in what might not surprise you, she became an alcoholic. She would continually believe she was being watched, and maybe she had a good reason to think so. On two separate occasions, once in 1969 and 1982, rumors began to circulate that listening devices were placed on her home phone. And by December 1989, things would take a sad turn, as Miriam would check into a hotel in San Jose under her sister's name, suggesting that she believed she was being followed. And within 24 hours of checking in, she was found deceased in the room with a plastic bag around her neck, one which had been tied tightly. Of course, detectives arrived and quickly concluded she had taken her own life, although this ignored the very obvious marks on her arm which indicated a struggle had taken place. And that's pretty much the mystery. What about Miriam's death? Was this some kind of assassination ordered by the government? Or did the police get it right and she took her own life? One thing that nobody debates is Miriam's mental health, as this suffered the rest of her life after this incident. She spiraled into alcoholism and was extremely paranoid, and only got more so as the decades wore on. Now you can question, was this some kind of mental illness that she just unfortunately got? Or did something really happen at Roswell that gave her PTSD? Maybe there was a crash which had these alien beings on it. Or maybe it was simply test pilots who were involved in some secret project which went badly and the government covered it up. Whatever the case, Miriam had a steep decline, which leads to our first theory that the detectives got it right. Her mental well-being got so bad that she ended up taking her own life. It's even possible it was an accidental death, and the marks on her body, which seemed to indicate a struggle, actually came from her falling due to being very drunk. And the police, out of respect to the family, just chose not to divulge that information. And obviously, the final theory is, she really did see something that was highly classified, and the government, either using their own intelligence assets, took Miriam out and made it look like she ended her own life, or they used some kind of mercenary to do it. Although, you have to question why it took 40 years for them to do so. Regardless, I'd love to hear your opinion on it. March 1st, 1882, the SS Jesmond, a British merchant ship, was making the voyage from France to New Orleans, where it was to drop off cargo of dried fruit, something it did often. And so far the journey seemed to be going normal. But it would be the next morning when something odd would happen. About 200 miles southwest of the island of Madeira, the captain of the SS Jesmond, a David Amory Robson, would spot something that he truly had not expected. He seen a large island, one that was very mountainous with a smoldering volcano, and was about 30 miles in length north to south. And the island looked like it had just came up from the sea, and it showed up on no charts or maps. Now what made this stranger, at around the same time, underwater volcanic activity was being picked up by monitoring stations in the Azores and the Canaries. And there was even a section of the ocean, about 7,500 square miles, that had become very muddy and was carpeted by dead fish. A lot of dead fish. An estimated 500,000 tons over this section of the ocean. Captain Robson was on one of these ships that had seen the huge deposit of dead fish, but he was more focused on the island that he had seen smoke bellowing from. He at first actually believed it was another ship in the area, until he got closer. Robson would then decide to take a small landing party to this new island and investigate. And it's here he found that it was largely made up of black basalt and a fine ooze, and there were dead fish covering basically anywhere you stepped. The island was completely barren other than this though, no wildlife or plants, which of course is how he reasoned that it had came up from the bottom of the sea. However, they did note numerous fissures all over, from which steam poured out of constantly. But it was after walking around a bit that the men discovered something even more odd. One of the sailors found a flint arrowhead. This excited them, and they began to search more, and they would notice in this area was some dirt in which they could dig, and so they did. And they had barely got the shovel in when they found more arrowheads and a few small knives. After these crazy discoveries, they would go back to the ship where they would wait until the following day and took some tools and about 15 volunteers to go back. This time, they would search the island and eventually would dig up a spot where they found a stone statue of a woman. It was a bas-relief sculpted into one side of an oblong rock and slightly larger than life-size. The piece had been encrusted with marine growth, and the men continued to search. It would be further inland that they would find 2 walls of unmortared stone. Now the excitement was really building up as they continued to find precious treasures. First was a sword, which was made of a yellow metal that they did not recognize. Then a number of spearheads, axe heads, and metal rings, before finally coming across pottery figures of birds and other animals. They would even find 2 large jars containing bone fragments and a nearly intact human skull, and some sources would even claim a sarcophagus with a mummy inside was taken aboard. However, the weather began to get bad, so Robson ordered them to take the haul back onto the ship so they could depart to their intended destination, that of New Orleans. Before going, however, he noted down the coordinates. They would then leave and reach the city's harbor at noon on March 31st. And it's here he would tell the story, and it would reach the local papers before it slowly spread out across the US. One reporter actually went to look at the artifacts and would get to personally inspect them. He would state, after handling many of the items, he believed them to be the real thing. He would also note that the captain, while in town, would let anyone come by to study them if they chose, which makes this next part that much stranger, because when he would go back to his home in London 2 months later, he left without all these artifacts, and no one is sure where they are today, although Robson had announced his intent to take them back to London to give to the British Museum. This case, now known as the Jesmond incident, was looked into closely by one researcher, a Lawrence D. Hills, who has put together the most thorough in-depth look into the case. He would eventually conclude that all the metal objects found by Captain Robson and his crew were made of tembaga, an alloy of 80% gold and 20% copper, one that was primarily used by pre-Columbian Mesoamerica and South American natives, and that term originated with the Spaniards who first made contact with them. But could it have a name that went back even further? Maybe that word was known as orichalcum. which is what Plato used to describe an alloy technique metalsmiths used in Atlantis. But how much, if any of this, is true? Well, we do have some data that might back it, because it wasn't long after this, another steamer rode through the area, that of the Westbourne, and it was captained by James Newdick. He was sailing from Marseille to New York, and as soon as he arrived, he would tell of seeing an island at the same exact coordinates of Captain Robson. In addition was the seismic event, which was recorded near the Azores and Canaries, and the miles and miles of dead fish, which was reported by numerous other ship captains, which even found their way to many papers at the time. Some of these fish were even taken aboard and eaten, and that might have been because they were already cooked by the heat generated from this volcano at the bottom of the ocean. There's also the fact that as we entered the 20th century and flight became an option, there have been a few incidents of pilots flying over this area who have claimed to have seen what looks like clusters of buildings under the water. And islands popping up in the ocean is not a fanciful tale either. It actually happened just as recently as 2023, right off the coast of Japan, although they usually disappear quickly after being swallowed by the waves. The difference in the story of Captain Robson and the SS Jesmond is this island seemed to have the signs of an ancient city that many speculate was Atlantis. However, there are also many reasons to doubt this story. For one, the British Museum cites they have no records that indicate any shipment of Atlantean artifacts that were en route by the SS Jesmond or a Captain Robson. Likewise, there was a SS Jesmond, but the problem is there were multiple SS Jesmonds, making it impossible to verify which one the story took place on. Same thing can be said with the SS Westbourne, which was supposed to have spotted the island a few days after the SS Jesmond and its crew. There are records, though, of a Captain Robson and a Captain Newdick on an Ancestry website, but did these two men captain these two ships? There's no records to indicate that. There's other things too, like the island has not been seen since, and the New Orleans paper retracted the story sometime after publishing it. And maybe most interestingly was, the SS Jesmond landed in New Orleans on March 31st, and the story was printed April 1st. But maybe the most important part in all this is the competitive merchant shipping game at the time. Considering how lucrative it was, it's extremely unlikely that a ship captain would waste 2 days exploring some random island. It just wouldn't be worth it. However, let's pretend like Captain Robson's account was legit, and all of this is true. Even then, the most likely scenario is they spotted volcanic rock that appeared briefly above sea level before being sunk down below the sea again. The muddy water, dead fish, and steam vents was nothing more than uplifted volcanic mound, and then everything else about the account was faked, like the artifacts. But even if there were artifacts found, it could have simply been debris washed out of the Mediterranean and swept up into the current, making it seem like they had found Atlantean relics. Likewise, if they really did find them, they were probably melted down for the gold, or they had just been misplaced in the back room of a museum somewhere. April 27th, 1983, in Pavagada, a town in Karnataka, India. A 5-year-old girl was outside playing when she mysteriously vanished. The time this happened is a bit confusing, maybe because some of the translation issues, but allegedly this occurred just after midnight, although I can't see many 5-year-olds outside playing at that time. Regardless, the disappearance would end up playing out tragically, because the next day, family and volunteers began to search for her, and her remains were found in the woods, her ribs being about a mile from where she was last seen. No explanation was given by the authorities, or not one I could find. However, it would just be 10 days later when another 3-year-old girl would fall asleep next to her mother in bed, only for her mom to wake up and realize the little girl was gone, with no clue as to what had happened. Her mother quickly reported the child missing and began searching the woods. At some point during the search, her grandfather would tell them he had seen a pair of glowing eyes staring at them before vanishing into the woods. This will be important later on. In this case, the girl was never seen again, nor were her remains ever recovered. However, a lead would soon emerge, because the next day, a woman came forward and claimed an hour before the 3-year-old disappeared, she was in her backyard with her own daughter when a wolf hopped the fence and tried to snatch up her kid, which she then began to fight. The wolf ran away into the direction of where the 3-year-old would then vanish. The woman's story was then confirmed by investigators who found paw prints that led around the house. If it was a wolf, he sure wasn't done, because 4 days later, a 2-year-old girl was asleep next to her mom and dad, and they would wake up to discover their little girl was missing. A massive search was launched again, and about a quarter of a mile away, particles of clothing were found, and sadly, one of her legs. It had been neatly cut off. Terror would strike again just 8 days later, when another 3-year-old girl was snatched out of bed from her mother. When she awoke and discovered this, she reported it and another search began, but it would be a week before anything was found. This time, it was just clothes and a pool of blood. Things would quieten for a bit after this. It would actually be 2 months later when on July 26th, a family of 5 were sleeping in the same room, 2 parents, 2 boys, and a daughter who was 3. When the parents awoke later, they found their 2 sons were still cuddled up in the room. However, the little girl was gone. This was the odd one because the family had 3 pet dogs, and strangely, none of them made a peep, which was certainly odd. Regardless, another search started, and it would be a couple of days before anything was found. This time, about 300 feet from the home, her clothes and a skull were found. Next to the skull was a single set of paw prints that led into the woods. Police dogs were used to track down the scent, which led to a large cave. For some bizarre reason, the police refused to go in, and eventually were like, oh well, mystery solved, and just kinda let it go. However, residents, as you might imagine, had a different response. They began hunting down and killing as many wolves as they could possibly find. Some even killed other random animals. After this, there were no more murders, and police simply closed the case. However, as you might be thinking, a lot of this doesn't seem to make sense. How many wolves simply waltz into a family home in the middle of the night, snatch up a baby without making a sound, and walk back out? In spite of the fact that in some cases remains were found, some people believe that this was one lone serial killer committing these crimes, and once he saw the public freak out and go into the woods killing anything that moved, he knew the best course of action was to get out of town. And considering the detective work may not have been the best anyways, it's possible that the police just didn't know how or didn't want to fool with investigating it further. There's also the strange fact that it was always little girls that were taken, even in the case when there were 2 boys in the room, which makes it sound like it was more of a human motive. There was even some suggestions later on that the kidnappings were used as part of ritual sacrifices for some type of cult or practitioners of black magic in the area. Likewise, there were not one of these cases where drag marks were found, and it's not likely a wolf just put a 3-year-old in its mouth and carried it away, and more likely, it would have had to drag its victim, unless it was like a really huge wolf. There also should have been blood trails and scattered remains, and then you had that one case of the neatly severed leg. That doesn't really match wolf kills either. Others suggest it might have been hyena attacks, which explain why only skulls and partial remains were left behind, and no drag marks, as they have been known to carry their prey. However, human-hyena conflicts are even more rare than wolf attacks. A serial killer is the second most likely theory. It does away with drag marks, and it also implies a distinct pattern and victim profile. And in one source, there is a claim that rocks were thrown at a parent who was searching for their child, and even more sources claim that the entrance to this cave was actually bricked up by stone, suggesting that the culprit was actually using it as a hideout. And once you bring in a cult or black magic, it might make even more sense. However, there was no evidence of this ever found. In 2012, the residents of Kampung Laksamana in Gombak, Malaysia were under a mysterious and disturbing threat of attack, one that kept residents up all night long, leading to groups patrolling the neighborhood with spotlights and sticks searching for something evil, something you have probably never heard of, known as Orang Minyak, or translated to Oily Man. It started when rumors began circulating the village of not one, but 2 of these beings spotted within a 10 days time. They are described as being clad in their underwear only, but also drenched in a black shiny oil, and they jump from roof to roof with ease and vanish into the night. One resident that spotted the two recorded that one of them was tall, stocky, and bald, while the other had curly hair, and he heard it breathing really loudly, sounding sorta like a cow. After shining his light on it, he noticed it reflected off the shiny black skin, but before he could say anything, it quickly shot up the roof and disappeared. Meanwhile, at another point, him and a few residents chased the other one into the bushes, only to find out it was the spot where it was known to recite its mantra and have an oil bath, as a large oil patch was still sitting there. Next to the oil was rice and noodles. They would even come back with other residents an hour later, only to discover the food was gone. But what is the oily man's goal? What is it that scares these people this much? Well, see, the oily man is actually a person who has began the study of black magic, but for them to meet the rite of passage, they have to, violate a number of virgin girls. So, you can see why so many of the townsfolk were greatly worried, with some of the townsgirls reporting feeling something or someone caressing them or calling for them to come outside. And in at least one occasion, a family was supposedly locked outside their home, forcing them to break in and finding a black heap under the table, a black heap with bloodstains, which resulted in patrols which lasted from midnight to dawn. At its height, it involved over 200 people, many whom carried weapons, and in spite of these patrols, and in spite of multiple sightings, the beings were never captured. And while this sounds completely ludicrous, the townsfolk were pretty shaken up. This was largely started as folklore, and took hold in some of the rural areas, where it may have just been more of a mass hysteria than anything else, although others suggest it's just another way to enforce social control by trying to keep women in line, discouraging them from going out at night, or any other behaviors that their society deems improper. And sadly, there have been guys take advantage of the myth and paint themselves in the oil or grease and pull off assaults. Finally, is the theory that it really exists, and it might even be some kind of cryptid. Hey guys, it's that time again. It's the Small Mystery Roundup. This is the part of the video where I take mysteries where there's not much information available, or mysteries that are just not interesting, and wrap them up into one segment. We start with the discipline of a psychic warrior. What do the following topics have in common? The Panama Canal, wife beating, bank robbery defense, and prison farms. If you guessed topics in a strange obscure book whose author is unknown, then you are a genius, because that's exactly what it is. The mysterious book is known as The Discipline of a Psychic Warrior, and although it came to prominence on the obscure media scene in 2021 after being rediscovered, it was actually published in 1978, and I already went over just a few of the topics, but it is actually more bizarre than you think. There's chapters dedicated to the do's and don'ts of professional boxing, team boxing, carpooling, and modern revisions of the Lord's Prayer. Opening the book to the first page also reveals the copyright, which says all rights reserved by the Foundation. And following the table of contents is the message which reads, "This book is dedicated to those who will suffer and die in the struggle to save our planet." And the book, as you might imagine, is not one of the traditional variety. Instead, it's just a collection of letters the writer has saved up over the years. Letters that he sent to various newspapers, specifically the Boston Globe, but also journalists, TV networks, politicians, sports organizations, and doctors. Furthermore, although the book does not have an author listed, the lost media community was quickly able to find the man, and his name was Ralph Paulson, who wrote another bizarre survivalist text known as The Rebuilding of God. Ralph had apparently spent years sending letters about anti-capitalist themes and survivalism to various media, where he suggested some of the craziest ideas, like injecting whales with radioactive material to save them, or having basic sexual training and IQ enhancement achieved by hypnosis. But who was Ralph? Well, the lost media community has worked on that too. He was most likely from Massachusetts, or maybe New Hampshire, and he had been a swimmer at Tufts University. He also went to Brockton High School in the late 60s and most likely wrote the letters in his late 20s during the time of Vietnam and Watergate. This one is not really much of a mystery anymore, as we now know who wrote it. Why is the only mystery. Maybe it was out of some moral cause he believed he was fighting for, or maybe he was just a little off in the head. Imagine you're driving down the road when all of a sudden you hear a noise that every traveler hates, the smack of the windshield. You quickly look over and discover that long crack running down, or that huge dot where something penetrated the glass, maybe something like a gravel from a truck. But what if you were 100% sure nothing struck you while driving? Or what if you just came out to your car one morning to discover the window now had a small indenture on it? Or even that the whole windshield had been shattered completely? Strangely, there have been periods of time where this happened frequently with no clear explanation, specifically between 1952 and 1954. Numerous reports of this phenomenon were recorded in Canada and the US alike. But it wasn't just cars that suffered these weird shatterings. Glass windows in houses were also broken apart or started pitting. Now, as mentioned, if this was a one-off or just an isolated location, that would be one thing. But this happened in waves from 1954 all the way up to 1974, with thousands of automobiles randomly getting hit by this. There's not much to theories on this one, but the mystery is found in John Keel's book called The Cosmic Question, and he sort of tried to connect it to pollution that may or may not have been caused by human beings. He also suggested a similar outbreak of busted windshields in the 1920s that he believed could be tied to skyquakes. However, if you do a Google search today on spontaneous windshield shattering, you'll quickly see that this happens all the time, and it can be attributed to different factors, such as defects, thermal shock, or extreme temperature fluctuation. The chromal ray phaco-ray was an early 20th century medical device which involved a 100-watt lamp used for color therapy, or now known as chromotherapy, as a way to project rays of cool sunshine. The lamp worked by focusing light through colored lenses which simulated the sun, and was recommended to use in dreary weather or cold climates. It was just one of a long line of quack medical inventions in the early 20th century, but this one at least had origins going way back in time, with the ancient Egyptians using colored crystals and sunlight for healing, because according to believers of chromotherapy, the light can be used to promote mental and physical wellness. In fact, you can still use the chromo ray today, or numerous different types of mood lamps on Amazon. I'm not sure what the mystery is on this one. I think it's supposed to be, does it really work? I know times are hard right now, and it's quite possible you have applied for multiple jobs, never getting an interview. But what if I told you there is a research associate / personal assistant job posted right now that could pay you up to $100,000 a year? Well, you might think this sounds like a scam, but this one is actually a mystery, because in 2004, an ad would run in the classifieds of the New York Republic, a magazine, which read, "Ideal candidate would be highly intelligent, resourceful, and have exceptional communication skill, and would undertake special research projects and various administrative tasks on behalf of a busy executive." The ad goes on to further state that they welcome applications from writers, musicians, artists, and other candidates pursuing professional goals in their free time. They also state you would be working in a casual atmosphere in a beautiful space with gifted individuals. If interested, apply at mtgen2@gmail.com. Now, this ad already sounds vague enough and a little bit sketchy, but what makes it odd is this ad has now ran for over 20 years straight. In that time, it's barely changed. Although it used to be mtgen2@gmail.com in the original ads, it is now gen8@spfine.com. Other than that, there have only been minor alterations. The ad has also popped up on Craigslist under different variations. However, this is another one that has been partially solved, because the author seems to have been discovered. On the Craigslist ad, the email address was revealed to be Craig-Gen at career.deshaw.com, an investment management firm known as D.E. Shaw, started by David E. Shaw in 1988. Why they are seeking talented individuals with such a vague ad in a magazine is still a mystery, however. The United States is Conscious is a conspiracy/philosophical thought experiment which tries to show that the US matches all of the materialist hallmarks of consciousness. For example, materialists argue that since rabbits are made of matter, have brains, nervous systems, and behave in ways which show awareness, then they must be conscious. And since they are conscious, it's natural to assume that if aliens exist, even though they are different than us, they too would be conscious beings. And since that is the case, then why can groups not be conscious? Even large groups, like a company or a country. Could the US, or any other nation, be like one big slow brain, using its communication networks, decision-making structures, memory, which might be its archives and records, as well as using its senses, like polls and surveillance tools, could be indicative that the US is a conscious entity. The theory goes on, but you get it. It's basically just an experiment to gauge if groups of people could serve as one consciousness. Over the 14th and 15th centuries, a war was waged which has since went down as one of the more important of all of Europe. I am of course talking about the 100 Years' War waged between the Kingdom of England and the Kingdom of France. And it's in this war that one of France's national heroes would come to prominence, Joan of Arc. At 17 years old, she convinced Charles VII that she was receiving visions and messages from saints, urging her to support the king in his attempt to drive the English out. She did such a good job that he would even let her lead an army at the Siege of Orleans in 1429, turning the tide of the war. Unfortunately, she would be captured the following year by Burgundian allies of the English, where she was put on trial and burned at the stake at just 19 years old in 1431. That is all basic history, and you probably already knew. But is it possible that was all a lie, and Joan really survived? That's what this next conspiracy theory alleges, and for good reason. It seems several young women would come forward after Joan's execution and claim to be her. The most famous example was that of Jeanne d'Armoise. She would come forward 5 years after, in 1436, claiming she was the real Joan and had miraculously escaped the execution. She was so convincing that even Joan's brother believed it was her. She would exploit her newfound fame to gain gifts and money over the next 4 years until 1440, when her charade was finally discovered. Or at least, that's what the accepted history states. Some modern-day authors have speculated on this account by suggesting that Joan really did take on the identity of Jeanne d'Armoise and married a French knight named Robert d'Armoise and lived a fairly normal life, even having a family. Alright guys, that's the end of the Small Mystery Roundup. Before we get back to the video, I would like to remind you, if you're enjoying it, please give me a like and a subscribe. And if you're interested in supporting the channel, there's a link down below for YouTube membership or the Patreon. As of now, the members are able to enjoy over 5 hours of exclusive content. I also have a link for a Buy Me a Coffee if you're interested in that. But now, let's get back to the video. For this next one, we go back in time through the web archive and visit a site known as UFOfreeparanormal.com. It was a website where readers would send in emails about their paranormal experiences that would in turn be posted to the stories section. This one would come in 1997 from someone going by the name Nermal. And Nermal was in his 50s when he sent this and would tell a story recalling his childhood way back in 1944 or 1945. As a young boy around 4 to 5 years old, he would write that in Kissimmee, Florida, he and his mother were standing on the side of the road waiting to be picked up by his father and grandmother. The area where they were waiting had very little traffic, and from here, they would see the family vehicle, a black Ford, start driving towards them. Soon, he spotted his grandmother and father inside driving, and strangely, neither occupant would look at him or his mother. Instead, they just drove on by. Even in spite of the fact that him and his mom were sitting there waving at them to get their attention. Regardless, the car kept going and went on around the corner. He would then turn to his mother, and they were both surprised. And then his mom began rambling and saying bad stuff about her husband and mother-in-law, as she was pretty upset that he was making her stand there and wait. However, the car would return several minutes later, and this time it slowed down and stopped. They would get into the car, and they asked, "Why did you refuse to slow down and let us in the first time?" And strangely, his father said, "We just got here." He then told them they must have seen another couple that looked just like them, because they had not been passed by. His father and mother then began to argue before they dropped the discussion and proceeded on with the drive. Fast forward to 12 years later, and Normal would bring up the weird experience to his father again, asking if he had remembered that occasion and the ensuing argument with his mother after they got into the car. He replied he remembered, but then he told Normal something else. That had actually happened to him one other time in the early 1940s, and this weird phenomenon seemed to run in the family. Normal would close his account by stating that although he clearly seen the car and his father and grandmother, it made no sound, nor was there any smoke coming from the tailpipe. He also noted that his mother would sometimes remember the incident and other times was not able to recall it. He would also note after this, he would be seen in places before he arrived. Now interestingly, this phenomenon is not known well here, but it's actually a big part of Scandinavian folklore, and it's known as Vardøger, and basically, it's this weird occurrence of a spirit predecessor who precedes a person in a location or activity. They do this by mimicking their footsteps, voice, scent, and or appearance. It's often described as a warning spirit or phantom double. So did Normal see a family Vardøger? Well, unsurprisingly, the skeptical take is it was all mistaken identity or coincidence. The two just saw the same model and color car with two strangers who looked vaguely familiar to his dad and grandmother. But it's also possible that his memory was just distorted over time, along with his father's, and considering that his mother didn't remember the story at all sometimes, it could also suggest the same. But maybe he really did see a Vardøger. Take a look at this photo. What is it you see? If you said an older man looking out at a bear crawling ahead of his path, you would be correct. Maybe. See, while this looks like a bear, there's one problem. This photo comes from Australia, and there are no bears native to Australia, so what gives? The mystery begins in 2000 when the small town of Gayndah, located in Queensland, would begin to receive press coverage over sightings of a bear in the area. Of course, brought on by the aforementioned fact that there shouldn't be any bears there. However, what really got the story receiving headlines across the world was when this bear, now known as the Gayndah Bear, would be photographed by a Peter Raffles and a Julian Knott, the man you see in the photograph. According to them, they had been hearing of sightings for several weeks leading up to their own encounter. Apparently, this bear liked to come into town and snatch cantaloupes, where it was then sometimes spotted under the houses of residents, chewing away. There were also reports that it was spotted standing on its hind feet, taking mandarins out of trees, but maybe most curiously, there were even instances of it stealing tin cans filled with cookies, which it would then open and snack on. But on the day they encountered it, Peter was helping Julian find rocks for his aquarium when their dog spooked the creature, and thankfully, Peter just happened to have his camera on him and snapped this photo. The men were ridiculed in the press for being dumb country bumpkins, although, in their defense, they never claimed it was a bear. In fact, Julian would later state he believed it was a wombat, which is native to the area. However, as mentioned, this sighting was only one of several. In fact, a month prior, around Christmas, a man working in his orange orchard, Alan Buckles, spotted an animal walking bipedally that he was sure was not a wallaby, and noted its most curious characteristic as being its long snout. Later in the day, his sister was working in the same orchard about 200 feet away from where Alan sighted the creature, and she, Shirley Humphreys, seen the same creature, but she got a better description, describing its short arms and dark hair. But she took it a step further and stated that the animal was straight up a bear. It also left unusual tracks that she compared to looking like large dog prints. The two then put together the fact that they had also had some food come missing up lately, specifically eggs, along with tools from the shed several weeks prior to this, and they now believe this creature was responsible. Then we have an account from the man who ran the local pound, a John Bowen, who had received several calls over a 9-month period about a bear-like animal peering through residents' windows. These were the most famous sightings, but there were more, and in general, the creature was always described as being around 3 foot tall and moved at a slow pace. It had black or dark brown hair about 2 inches long. He was most often described as bear-shaped, but curiously, was never seen as aggressive and would flee on all fours if approached by a human. And that's pretty much it. So what were people seeing? Well, for starters, it's most likely too small to be a bear. However, it could be that Julian's theory is correct. He was nothing more than a wombat. They fit the description and have been known to raid food, as well as sitting or standing up. Others suggest that it could have just been a misidentified animal, such as a large feral dog or dingo. Of course, you also got the theory that the whole thing was a hoax by these two men, then it just kind of spiraled out of control. While the cryptid variant of this theory suggests it was a juvenile yowie, basically the Australian version of Bigfoot. Our next mystery takes us to the confines of the National UFO Reporting Center website, where users can go and file reports on their own weird sightings. The following comes from May 2003 in Illinois. The letter would open by stating he was writing this on behalf of his sister and her friends who had just told him a crazy story. As he had began researching what they had described to him, he came across the website and he was now searching for an explanation. According to them, his sister and her friend were attending a bonfire out in the country with about 15 to 20 other kids. It would go on until around 2:45 a.m. when everyone started winding down and going home. His 17-year-old sister and her 17-year-old friend, whom he simply called E, was with her 19-year-old sister, A, and these three remained behind to clean up. They had drove their mom's van to the fire and started loading in the chairs to take back to the shed. After unloading them, they went back in the van when the author's sister would notice something standing off in the driveway in the distance. She motioned to E to come look at it. They at first thought it was someone who had attended the party, but they soon realized that everyone had already left, so they jumped into the van. They would then take a look back at the driveway and the house, and that figure was no longer standing there. His sister claimed that it looked like a man, except lighter colored, or like he was wearing white clothing. Regardless, they started the van after convincing each other that it was safe and that it was probably just E's dad who had walked out to check on them. They then went back towards the fire to finish picking up. It was around 3:20 a.m. by this point, and they headed up the driveway and into the grass, and down the hill towards the fire. The van had its brights on, and his sister would suddenly spot what she described as frozen things, some kind of figures or creatures in 2 separate rows, about 15 in each row. These beings were 3 to 4 feet tall and were standing about 15 feet directly in front of this van. Their heads sort of looked like a Christmas light, and they were connected to the body, but she couldn't see how. They held up their arms, but the girls were not able to see hands. In fact, his sister described them as looking like stick people, dark gray or brown in color. These beings stood there, not even moving, but it scared his sister enough that she began to cry. Then the girl screamed for E to get the van going, which she did by pulling out and leaving town. They then drove around a bit, trying to calm down, and rationalizing what they had just seen. Was it a deer, trees, or something as simple as bushes? Well, deep down, they knew that none of those were the answer. They would eventually calm down about 2 hours later and went back, and by this time, the sun was out. They would even go to the spot where they had seen them, and nothing was there. After this, his sister would come home and tell the family. The event had shook her up enough that she couldn't sleep nor eat. He would close the report by stating he hoped someone had similar accounts. and he was simply looking for an answer. So, let's give him one. More than likely, the headlights from the van were cutting through the darkness and making ordinary objects like a fence post or tree branches look like frozen humanoid stick figures. Our brains are wired to recognize shapes and patterns anyways, and it could be quite easy to do at 3 a.m. in the morning. It's also possible they simply saw chairs stacked up, left from the bonfire. Regardless, once one of them began to panic, they all got scared, and group panic took over, and they all began to believe they were looking at stick figures. Of course, it's also possible someone was out there trying to play a prank on them. July 3rd, 1884, the Daily British Colonist, a newspaper in Canada, would tell of a strange account of railroad workers digging a tunnel outside of Yale, British Columbia, when they came upon a man sleeping on the tracks. As they got closer to investigate, they soon discovered that he was more like a hairy half-man, half-beast, which promptly tried to run away. But after a short 5-minute chase, he was captured. The strange man only stood about 4 foot 7 inches tall and weighed about 127 pounds. And soon, he earned the name Jacko. He was described as having long black strong hair and resembled a human except for his hands, or maybe more accurately described as paws, which were covered with a glossy hair 1 inch long, along with his feet, which were the same. They also noted his forearm was much longer than that of a regular man. Now, whatever happened to Jacko is not recorded or followed up on, and he is really not our mystery here anyways. It's about something bigger, because it wasn't just this one report of Jacko. Actually, there were reports of similar encounters made by the Hudson Bay Company going back to 1864. But what exactly are these creatures? They sound too human to be a Sasquatch, yet they clearly exhibit animal characteristics. Well, that brings us to the topic of Human-Bigfoot interbreeding. Yes, this is a real theory, but it's not something new. In fact, several old Indian legends told stories about their women being abducted by Sasquatch or Sasquatch-type cryptids and taken away, and having children by them. Some take the claims back even further to the Book of Genesis, which describes Esau being born as a red baby with skin like a hairy robe. Then there's the fact that some of the earliest European literature makes references to wild men living deep in the woods, often described as being tall, hair-covered, and having remarkable agility, with the ability to leap vast distances and outrun men. And in some Irish chronicles, they were even said to be impossible to civilize. But it's in some of these accounts that would state that these wild men had a lustful desire for human females, any that might wander alone out into the forest, where they would then force them into intercourse. There's even some speculation that this might be the origin of the satyr legend, the part man, part goat. Similar legends come from South American tribes that were isolated from each other for centuries. These legends told of the intermixing of humans and the hairy ones. And it's important to note here, in almost all these accounts, it is the human female, Sasquatch male pairings. There's no accounts of human male, female Sasquatch pairings. Since this one is such a taboo, strange subject, I'm going to wrap it up here and let you make your own theories. You can let me know down below. Have there been cases of Sasquatch human interbreeding? Alright guys, that brings us to the end of this installment of the Obscure Unsolved Mysteries Iceberg. We are now about 3/4 of the way through Layer 4. I hope you guys enjoyed. Goodbye, and good night.